Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Hey everybody, it's Gary, and I'm back for the second season of Tales from the Garage, officially starting. Even though I was doing an advertisement essentially a few days ago for my latest release. I got involved in a conversation with my buddy Carm, and I don't know how Terry Riley came up. He's definitely one of my top 3 favorite composers. And though oddly enough, I wouldn't consider that I have a lot of his work, but I have a good overview. I think when it comes to an artist, you can have a sampling of their work, and a sampling may not necessarily even give you a good insight as to what they do, because you can pick up a very oddball album by an artist. So I would say I have more than a sampling of his work. Maybe I have an overview in terms of I have touched on the different areas of his recorded history and the types of projects and the types of albums he does. But I don't think it's definitive. So his first, and when he started, he was one of those guys that started minimalism in the early 60s, or what came to be known as minimalism, along with guys that were doing similar things at the same time, Philip Glass and Steve Reich. I will say that of the minimalists, Terry is definitely my favorite, but he really doesn't work in the minimalist genre anymore so much. He's doing definitely offbeat compositional things. The light in here really stinks. It's really harsh. Plus, I don't know if you can hear it, there's a lot of noise outside. I never film during the day for a couple reasons. It doesn't put me in the mood. I like being here in the late evenings when it's dead quiet and otherworldly, as I am in a place with no windows, no clocks or anything in this little garage den of mine. But in order to get this out, I decided to start filming during the day. And there's a sound outside that sounds like a leaf blower, but it's not, because I took a look outside. It's loud as hell. It sounds like somebody's standing there with a leaf blower, but I don't see any trucks. There's nobody with a leaf blower. I don't know if somebody's house is about to blow up or what this is, coming from one of those big electrical boxes or something. So if there's a sudden explosion, then you know what it was. So how I discovered Terry Riley, I was not in the know so much when I came across Terry Riley. And I'm going to be doing this one in bits and pieces because somebody complained, and I don't understand this actually, that they don't actually have time to watch my 8-hour videos. And I'm like, what, you can't call in sick to work? It's not like I do it every week. But I knew when I pulled out, like 17 or so albums I have by him, that talking a little bit about them was probably going to end up being another, hour and a half video or something. So I'm going to chop this up into bits. And I'm going to stop at intervals. And then, whenever, do part 2, 3, whatever. When I was getting out of rock music, I had no guidance from anybody. There was no internet. So the best you could do, the only thing you could do really, is not even mail order catalogs, because you kind of had to know that a company existed that sold oddball music by mail order. So unless you're already into that music, you weren't aware that there were catalogs that catered to that kind of music. And I'm talking about, avant-garde and classical and experimental music and minimalism and electronic music. Well, if you don't know that stuff exists, you're not going to come across a mail order catalog. Those were one of the primary ways of getting them. The only other way, going back to the late 1970s now, was largely in the well-stocked record stores that had imports. And I really knew nothing about classical music, I knew next to nothing about jazz. This is even before I got into ECM artists, not by a whole lot, but about the only thing I think I'd ventured out into, and I'm not even sure the exact order. I may have discovered Klaus Schultze before Terry Riley, but I was definitely on the path looking for something else. At that time, don't think I had any even Tangerine Dream or knew that there was a connection between Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schultze, because there was nowhere to read up about it. I did subscribe. There was a few good magazines back in the day, back in the late 70s. There was one that started out being real good called Musician Magazine. Ended up being more of a poppy thing in the end. But there was a few magazines out there that did record reviews. One was called Record Review, and that was the best one. And they did reviews of everything by category. So they would have a rock and pop category and maybe a soul category, whatever. But they had a classical and jazz. So you knew what you were reading, and you could, let me experiment and see what I can read in these genres and learn something about them. That was about the only way. And also doing blind buys, which, actually 100% of what I did was blind buys back then. Even if I knew an artist, I didn't know what a particular album sounded like. But I bought, and I think I left it in my basement when I left. I bought an LP of one of Philip Glass's earliest albums that he ever put out on a tiny label with his ensemble. I think it was 4 organs and phase patterns, but I'm not even sure. I think it was just 4 organ players. Had no idea who Philip Glass was. It was in the import section. Knew nothing about minimalism. And I figured that Philip Glass was a European guy because the only albums that I saw by him were in the import section. That was pretty intense. It was one of those heavy, fast pattern things. The next one I bought was by Terry Riley. Here's probably my favorite album of all time to boot. And I remember the day I bought this, the store I bought it in. It was wintertime. I remember driving home with the album. I knew nothing about it or him. It's a soundtrack, actually, and it's very short. It's slightly over 30 minutes long, because it is soundtrack music. And it's just Terry Riley by himself. He plays all the instruments. 90% of it is Hammond organ and various settings, many different settings he uses. He squeezes a lot of sounds from very percussive sounds out of the Hammond organ to, maybe the larger church organ sounds that you might expect. But it's also my favorite organ album because of the variety of sounds on it that he gets. It's the back cover that essentially, I'm trying to do this without glare, but I can't get it on a glare. I just can't get the glare off of there. But anyway, there's a picture of him in the back here, just sitting at his keyboard, which was actually this photo was taken during the recording of the soundtrack, and it looked interesting. And from what I could tell on the back, it looked like it was only him doing it. And I was very much always into all solo albums, albums without any additional musicians supporting him. And that's what this looked like it was. I knew nothing about minimalism or Terry Riley. Again, I thought Terry Riley was a European guy based on this. Didn't see any of his albums in, I don't think I thought to look in classical section to see if there was other albums of his there. There must have been at this time. Because this would have been about I want to say 1977 or 78. 78 it had to be, because this edition on the French label, the music is from 1975 from a film soundtrack, but there's a 1978 date on here, and I must have bought it pretty much when it came into the store. And I never knew how actual rare this was, and not easy to obtain. So even though I bought it at a chain store, a big chain store that had not around anymore, called Harmony Hut, and it was $7.49, which was kind of a lot back then for an album. So I really took a chance with it. But I remember driving home with it, and the only thing I didn't know anything about Terry Riley, didn't know anything about the music on there. About the only thing I knew is I recognized the actor Klaus Kinski, which means nothing because it's just obviously a still photo for the movie. But I was floored when I got home. I love the sound of the organ, especially the Hammond, or any organ that has a lot of the different drawer bars, and the drawer bars that get different sounds, and from soft to percussive to things that sound like reeds or woodwind instruments. With synthesizers now able to mimic that stuff, people tend to forget the range of sounds that these big organs had. And they're kind of forgotten now because, people going for that, trumpet sound or horn sound or string sound can get a fairly reasonable facsimile, I guess, from a synthesizer. But, the fact is that the organ, without actually sounding exactly like the instruments it was trying to mimic, also had another quality of sound to that sample, or what we call the sample now. They weren't really samples. And nobody thinks to use them anymore, So, if you hear somebody playing an organ, I haven't heard anybody play organ in recent years that didn't pretty much use the standard sound that I'm bored to crap with, Even the young guys that specialize in organ, I don't see them, really playing around with the sound at all. They use a pretty standard sound. Whatever there's one or two sounds out there, and that's all they seem to use. I don't know if maybe they're not using the drawer bars anymore. They're kind of big to cart around in terms of live performance. But, I'm talking studio albums, these guys, and I don't hear a lot of sounds being utilized on the studio albums either. And it's kind of sad. It's a lot of the really good early analog synthesizer sounds from the 1970s. There's some really good sounds out there that they created when they were trying to emulate things like string ensembles and string sections. But people tend not to use them anymore because the sampling technology allows you to play things that sound very much like real string ensembles and horns, etc., etc. But they kind of forget that those original sounds, even though they weren't that close to mimicking what they were attempting to, such as a string or horn ensemble, they had their own quality of sound to them. They had their own unique take on the sound, so you were aware that you were listening to a synthesizer, but it was just a different sound to it, and still a valid sound. You don't hear anybody saying, well, I don't want to hear violin because it's an old sound, and yet a lot of these 70s settings from synthesizers that are really good are just not used anymore very much. And so to me, this is also the ultimate album of organ in terms of the sounds that you can get out of an organ. Not like it's trying to be a demonstration record. It's not. There's maybe half a dozen different sounds, but they're quite different from each other. And Terry Riley also early came up with this kind of live looping sampling technology where he could play a phrase and right then and there repeat the phrase and play over it. I think he's the first guy that ever did that. This is long before Robert Fripp and Eno did it. Probably this is where Eno got the idea from, because Riley was doing it in the late 60s. And Terry Riley was basically best known for an album I don't even have, for In C, at least the original version of In C, that came out in 1964. And that was quite innovative in that it was a piece written for it was written for an ensemble, but the ensemble could be anywhere from, I forget what the original number was, 8 to 12 people, up to 35 people. And each person had certain phrases that they were required to play, but they could choose to play them at whatever interval they wanted, or repeat a phrase however many times they wanted before going on to the next phrase, and even making pauses wherever they wanted, so that no two performances are ever going to be the same, and everything is going to overlap in all different ways because everybody's independently working on their phrases. So it's quite an interesting concept, and again, it's probably one of the places where somebody like Brian Eno got ideas for his generative music, or music that had some kind of concept behind it that involved performances being different and the whole overlapping thing that he got into with albums like Discreet Music and things like that. I knew none of this at first, getting into Terry Riley and thinking he's some European guy. But this I liked right. It's a very accessible, actually, oddly enough, probably the most accessible album I've ever heard by him. Not very well known, actually, but later on, Terry got into some pretty avant-garde stuff. Started working with something called Just Intonation, which is a whole different tuning system that your ears, when you first hear it, it sounds like everything's out of tune, because there's more notes per scale, per octave, than in the Western music that we know. And it's not even different like Asian music, like Chinese or Japanese music would be. The pitches are actually different in Just Intonation. So it's very hard to wrap your ears around that. So oddly enough, my first purchase of a Terry Riley album was, one of his more accessible ones. I don't have the original version of In C, and I have a couple other versions that came that vary a great deal from one to the other. And this album is also the one that I most awaited. I had a list of, probably a couple hundred albums when CDs first started coming out that I wanted to come out on CD, but this probably was always number one. And it took many, many years for this. I thought it wasn't going to come out on compact disc. So it was literally the first album that I ever bought once the technology of computers caught up, and I was able to actually play a platter on my turntable and record it into my computer and burn it onto a recordable CDR. This was the first album that I chose to do that with, because I had kind of worn it out. And the funny thing is I didn't even play the album that much. I would only play it when I would make a cassette copy of it to listen to, so I wouldn't wear the album out. But I made so many cassette copies for myself over the years that I ended up wearing out the album anyway. Oddly enough, waiting forever for this to come out on CD, which it finally did. It took a lot of years, because I didn't think CDs were around like in '85 or so. The CD didn't come out till 2007, which to me was forever. But actually, in 2006, I want to say, I found another interesting album along the same lines. Here's another soundtrack. It's for a French movie, and everything is in French on here, but there is a translation called Happy Endings, but it's music from the film La You Fermace, something like that, French movie. And again, another soundtrack where the music's quite a bit more accessible than many of his later things. And again, this is from 1972, so it's a bit earlier than the previous album called Lifespan that I showed. But this was recorded in March and April of '72. Not as good as the Lifespan album, the first one I showed, but nothing is. But still, it's two 18.5-minute pieces, instead of the Lifespan album, which has very short pieces on it, anywhere from 2 minutes and 10 seconds to one piece that's 12.5 minutes on the Lifespan album. This was just two pieces that are 18.5 minutes long, with Terry Riley playing organ again, and a bit more saxophone in here than he plays on the Lifespan soundtrack. But the Lifespan soundtrack, which has also a little bit of saxophone, a little bit of wordless vocals, done very well, and even a little bit of tabla playing. I thought the tabla player might have been a guest, because I don't know how he would have recorded it and sync up the organ to the tabla, the way it comes out on the record. But I actually, just last year, sent an email off to Terry Riley's webpage. Didn't think I'd get an answer. Just wanting to verify that Terry did play all the instruments on this Lifespan soundtrack, including the tabla. And I got an answer from somebody, and I want to say, chances are it was probably a member of Terry's family, that yes, he played the tabla and everything else on Lifespan. Because the credits didn't actually specify that he played everything, but it didn't list any other musicians either. moving along. So far, when I discovered, by the way, this soundtrack, I paid a bit more than I wanted to for it, and on LP, which I prefer CDs. But again, this was something that didn't come out on CD. Shortly after I bought that soundtrack, all of a sudden, what comes out on CD, new cover and everything, but a combination of the Lifespan album and the Happy Endings, the other soundtrack album from 1972, both being so short they comfortably and easily fit on a single CD. This is still in print. I'm probably going to buy another copy just in case it ever goes out of print. Came out 2007 on Elysian Fields. Looks like is the record label. I don't think it's Terry's own label. And it's got, the both soundtracks. Even reproduced that picture from the back of the Lifespan album. It's got the two full soundtracks there on one shiny, beautiful disc. And let me tell you, it was a revelation hearing it again without all the scrapes and the I couldn't order this one fast enough. It was wonderful hearing it again without all the vinyl wear and tear that I had. This would be my first recommendation. It's very accessible. Both soundtracks are. I think it's a good introduction. It's nothing like his later works, which are much more classical, maybe much more difficult. And quite a bargain. Regular CD price, which I would have paid more than twice for. My next thing that I picked up by him, now I was on a Terry Riley tear, was a double album set. This is also from France. I guess this was another import I bought called Persian Surgery Dervishes. And just solo organ, solo keyboard, 2 concerts. It's a 2-disc set. 2 concerts. One was a concert from 1971. The other was one from 72. First concert's in Los Angeles, second concert's in Paris. They're very, very similar, musically speaking. It's just Terry Riley, listed as compositions and improvisations. Terry Riley, electric organ, and feedback. I think what they mean by the feedback is that he has that looping technology going on here where he plays a phrase on the organ and he plays over it. It's 90 minutes. It's a lot of organ solo play. I think it's a lot. It's very listenable for me, but it's not up there with the Lifespan soundtrack or so. It gets trance-like after a while. It's all the 2 performances. They're both around 45 minutes roughly. Just split up into 2 sides. When they released it on CD, I thought they would actually edit out. Here's the CD. I thought they would actually edit out the 2 parts, that were on, LP side 1 and 2, and join it together as one big piece. Because apparently each of these was just one big long, essentially an improvisation. And I thought they would just connect the 2 parts, but they didn't. They kept the CD issue exactly the same as the LP, with each side running 20 some odd minutes. But the second side in both cases of both concerts, basically you could tell is picking up where side 1 left off. So it's interesting that they kept it the same as the LP issue. Very good, very trancy, but maybe lacks. Well, it's a good performance of just solo organ music and a little bit of that looping technology. It's still accessible because it's not the just intonation thing or anything that's really kind of difficult to listen to. But at 90 minutes, it might be a bit much for a lot of folks in that it doesn't really change a lot. Here's the photo, and the only liner notes are in French. So here's a French liner notes. And I like that picture of Terry Riley playing with a reel-to-reel tape deck, which is, I believe, how he created the loops that he used somehow. using a reel-to-reel tape deck and then playing back what he just recorded, etc., etc. So I knew this was going to happen. I'm 25 minutes in, and I'm barely scratching the surface of my first few purchases. I would put this on the recommend list, but you have to know what you're getting into. It's 90 minutes of, solo trancy organ stuff. Doesn't do any vocals, doesn't play any soprano saxophone as he's known to do. But again, it's a live performance, so it's maybe not quite as... It's actually got a pretty good sound, but maybe not quite as perfect as a studio album would be. So I'm going to call it right now. I didn't even scratch the surface here. So I'm going to be doing a part 2 later on, and take it one part at a time on Terry Riley. Like I said, not really a career overview, but a complete definitive career thing, but maybe a slight overview of what it is he does and why I love him so much. And I was having a conversation at one point, and I don't know why this thought came to me, but once I said it, it stuck with me. I said, and I don't apply this to just about any other composer, but I was saying to somebody once when I guess I don't understand some of Terry Riley's works, and they're the kinds of things that, I might have to go back to in 20 years kind of thing, and then I would get it, because he's just so far beyond my comprehension in a lot of cases. And I said, well, it's Terry Riley's world, and we just live in it, and I stick by that. And the funny thing is I've said that many times since, and that thought just came to me regarding, of all the musicians I love, regarding Terry Riley. And but for some reason, I think it's Terry Riley's world, and we just live in it. So I'm going to be doing additional parts as I go on, talking about some of his other works. But I wanted to keep this one under 9 hours, so that you'd only miss one day of work by watching the video. And then I'll pick up, with the other albums I have here and talking a little bit about them. So I hope everybody's doing well. And there'll be more Tales from the Garage. Take care, everybody.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.